I'm Julia Page. For this week's discussion, I chose option 1, which says participants and historians today consider the Vietnam War a tragedy. Why? To what extent did the U.S. political and military leaders misunderstand the situation in Vietnam, and what about this war generated such intense opposition on the American home front? So we're going to break this down a little bit. So for the first question, participants and historians today consider the Vietnam War a tragedy. Why? Really, baseline is millions of Vietnamese people lost their lives in the war, and I think it was over 58,000 Americans died as well. And for something that people weren't even sure they believed in too, because it was such a controversial war of whether the U.S. should have been involved in the first place or not. It deepened political divisions in the U.S. and it created it damaged the trust again towards the government, because we found out in the war that they weren't telling the truth about some things. And then, to what extent did the U.S. the U.S. political and military leaders misunderstand the situation in Vietnam? So they treated the U.S. Political and military leaders, they misunderstood it because they treated it and they thought it was a communist threat. So they thought it, they said they were thinking like, oh, if I stop communism here, then it won't spread to the U.S., because they thought that was the goal overall. So the U.S. thought that Vietnam was fighting to spread communism, when in reality, they were fighting to unify Vietnam and end foreign influence. So the U.S. treated the war as a communist threat instead of understanding that Vietnam wanted foreign freedom, because Vietnam had been controlled by foreign powers, such as France and then Japan, and then I think France again. And then for the last question, what about this war generated such intense opposition on the American home front? So Americans saw the war as unfair, and low-key unwinnable, and finding out that the government lied, they also found it dishonest. They didn't want more Americans dying for a cause that they weren't even sure about, and it didn't make sense to them, which is understandable, because some things that the government was saying didn't line up with what the soldiers were saying or what journalists wrote, and that damaged trust. And the Pentagon Papers? They were leaked documents that also worked as proof that the president had misled the public about the war's progress, which also damaged trust. And people didn't think the draft was fair. So they're like, why should my son or my husband, who is working and who is not willing to go to this war and fight, have to go? Didn't make sense. Anyways, that's my 2 cents on the matter. That's my option 1 answer. Have a good day.